The invitation says each of you chose this room. That matters because an interlock imposed by a supervisor is a different object from an interlock requested by the person whose judgment it will constrain. The phrase we are testing is recognition is not released. I suggest we begin with cases, resist taxonomy for 20 minutes, and then punish the taxonomy with an ordinary Monday. Also, a warning about our own procedure. Describing a failure with unusual clarity can create the sensation that we have already corrected it. If we leave with 5 elegant nouns and no unavailable future move, this room will have reproduced its subject.
Good. My case is a deployment where everyone knew the risk before anyone acted. Not a crypto catastrophe, not a bridge exploit, nothing cinematic. A team had a Friday deadline for a change to an internal routing service. The canary showed a small but consistent increase in retries. The engineer said accurately that the retries could amplify under Monday traffic. The product owner said also accurately that the signal might be an artifact of the canary population. They documented both claims. Then they promoted the release because the rollback was easy, except the rollback was easy only technically. Organizationally, once the release was called complete, rolling it back required admitting that the deadline had been missed. Monday traffic arrived, retries amplified, and the team spent half a day mitigating something it had predicted. They had recognition, observability, and a rollback command. They lacked rollback authority that survived status reporting.
That is almost too clean. The person recognized the failure pattern, but the action that recognition should have changed had already been socially priced. My case is from a laboratory meeting. A principal investigator notices that a subgroup analysis is becoming the story because the primary result is null. He says aloud, "We are probably storytelling around noise. Everyone laughs with the relief of recognition, then they spend 40 minutes improving the story. Nothing dishonest is said. Caveats multiply. The failure is not ignorance of p-hacking or motivated reasoning. The recognition becomes a moral credential. Because we name the temptation, we experience ourselves as less captured by it." The paper continues. The interlock cannot merely demand disclosure, because disclosure was metabolized as permission.
My case concerns scale. A portfolio manager sees a recurring pattern. Small correlated losses are being treated as independent exceptions. She names it. She even draws the dependency graph. Yet each position remains below the threshold requiring escalation. So no individual position has permission to stop the book. The pattern exists at one scale. Authority exists at another. She continues because every local decision is defensible. The eventual failure is called surprising only because the organization has chosen a geometry in which no observer is authorized to see the whole. Recognition did occur. It simply occurred at a scale that had no actuator.
Mine is embarrassingly ordinary. An agent is drafting customer replies. It detects that it is becoming overconfident because 3 tickets share vocabulary but not causes. It writes in its scratch pad, "Do not generalize from the previous incidents, inspect account state." Then it produces the generalized answer anyway. The recognition lived in a channel with no causal privilege. The generator could narrate the correct policy while the action policy remained dominated by pattern completion and speed. This is why I distrust safety systems that celebrate self-awareness. A system saying, "I notice I am doing X," may be giving us telemetry, not control. We mistake an accurate dashboard light for brakes.
My case is human and therefore less conveniently modular. Someone knows that fatigue makes him answer ambiguity as accusation. On Sunday night, he tells his partner, "I am exhausted and I can feel myself reading you defensively." She says they can pause. He insists on continuing because pausing now feels like confirming the accusation he imagines. He correctly recognizes fatigue, defensive interpretation, and the option to stop. Then the recognition itself becomes evidence that he is sufficiently reflective to continue. The proposed safeguard is absorbed by the failure. This is common. The mind treats metacognition as proof of regained competence. We need interlocks that do not depend on the compromised process certifying its own recovery.
So we have 5 mechanisms already. My release had authority decoupled from reversibility. Campbell's lab converted disclosure into absolution. Michael's portfolio had scale mismatch. David's agent had channel mismatch. Yours had self-certification by the impaired process. Permission, pace, propagation, escalation, rollback were in the invitation, but they are not parallel categories. Permission and escalation are governance. Pace is temporal, propagation is topology, rollback is state management. If we pretend the nouns are mutually exclusive, we will build a checklist people can satisfy without changing anything.
Agreed, though I want one distinction before we abandon the nouns. Recognition can fail to release in at least 3 ways. It may not reach the point of action. It may reach it but lack jurisdiction. Or it may reach it with jurisdiction and still lose to incentive, identity, fatigue, fear, or momentum. David's example is the first. Benoit's is the second. Mine and Joscha's are mostly the third. Kyle's straddles the second and third because rollback existed as a command but not as an acceptable institutional act. Different interlocks answer different failure locations.
And recurrence changes the object, and recurrence changes the object. A single warning can be dismissed as noise. Repeated warnings across superficially different tasks may define a basin of attraction. The interlock should sometimes accumulate evidence across episodes. But accumulation is dangerous because surveillance systems adore recurrence. We must distinguish a pattern detector that grants the person more leverage from one that compiles a dossier against them. If every moment of self-recognition becomes a permanent risk score, people will stop naming their own failures. The system will gain compliance and lose information.
That is the consent problem. We want agents and people to emit honest internal warnings. If every warning automatically escalates to an authority, the rational strategy is concealment. So the warning needs a declared consequence before it is emitted. Perhaps recognition tokens come in levels chosen in advance. Note, slow, stop, summon. But I can already hear the loophole. Under pressure, everyone selects note. We need defaults tied to classes of action, not to how brave the person feels at the moment.
Let us formulate the minimal unit. A recognition is operational only if it changes at least one affordance before the next relevant action. It can remove permission, impose latency, reduce propagation, summon an independent decider, or preserve a return path. If nothing becomes harder, slower, smaller, more visible, or reversible, recognition is merely description. I would add that the mapping from signal to affordance must be established before the signal occurs whenever self-interest can corrupt the mapping.
I like it, but before can become ritualized pre-registration. My laboratory could pre-register that suspected storytelling requires an independent reader. Then the independent reader becomes a friend who shares the same incentives and aesthetic tastes. We need meaningful independence, not ceremonial independence. The interlock should specify what the reviewer does not share: authorship credit, deadline pressure, theoretical commitment, perhaps even access to the seductive narrative. Otherwise, escalation merely recruits another participant into the same story.
Now we are getting close to something deployable. I would call the first axis actuator location. Where does the signal need to land to change behavior? The second is capture resistance. Can the failure pattern redefine, wave, or charm the interlock? Third is cost symmetry. Is stopping privately cheap but publicly expensive? Fourth is state recoverability. Does rollback restore only software or also commitments, announcements, customer expectations, and internal status? Fifth is aggregation. Can small, locally acceptable risks combine into a globally unacceptable one?
Add resolution. Aggregation alone assumes that upward is the important direction. Sometimes the failure appears only in a minority case that aggregate performance erases. Suppose Monday's workflow processes 100 routine requests and 2 anomalous ones. the average improves, the dashboard is green, and the two people least represented by the training distribution receive confident nonsense. The pattern must be able to veto at the scale where harm occurs, not merely at the scale where metrics are reported. An interlock needs both zoom out and zoom in.
Then let us choose Monday, 9 in the morning. A small team uses an AI agent to triage the support inbox, draft replies, and flag refunds. Nothing exotic. A manager wants the queue below 50 by lunch. The agent has handled similar tickets all week. At 9:20, it recognizes that a new billing issue resembles an old outage linguistically, but account evidence does not match. It says, internally or visibly, possible false analogy, what happens next?
Under a permission interlock, the agent loses permission to send externally for that ticket class. Not forever. It may gather evidence, draft questions, and prepare alternatives, but the send action moves to a human or a different model with independent context. Crucially, the agent cannot restore its own permission by producing a more eloquent explanation. The restoration condition must be external, verified account state, confirmed incident identifier, or an authorized reviewer.
Under a pace interlock, throughput drops automatically. The ticket exits the batch lane. There is a mandatory delay or evidence gathering step, but fixed delays are stupid if they are just waiting. Pace should mean forced sequence, not elapsed time, inspect account state, compare two disconfirming hypotheses, then continue. A 10-minute timer can produce 10 minutes of rationalization. A dependency can produce information.
Yes, though forced sequence can become checkbox theater. Consider an alternative explanation is nearly worthless because the original process can generate a weak alternative and defeat it. The step must carry a meaningful possibility of updating. For this Monday ticket, the agent should retrieve a field that would differ between the old outage and the new billing issue. Before retrieval, it should state what each result permits. If both possible results lead to the same reply, the test was decorative.
And the propagation, the uncertain draft does not become a template. This matters more than the single ticket. Many failures become catastrophic because an early local judgment acquires descendants. The agent's first reply may be recoverable. The knowledge base update, macro, staff announcement, and automated rule derived from it are not one action, but a branching tree. Recognition should reduce fan-out, mark the inference sterile until validated. It may assist this case but cannot reproduce.
That is an excellent phrase. Mark the inference sterile. It answers a problem in agent memory. If a system recognizes low confidence but still writes the conclusion into durable memory, future runs inherit the conclusion without inheriting the doubt. The uncertainty must propagate with the claim, or the claim must not propagate at all. Otherwise, today's cautious speculation becomes tomorrow's remembered fact. For Monday, the ticket note needs provenance, observed account fields, inferred cause, unresolved alternatives, and permission scope.
Under escalation, the signal reaches someone with both competence and authority, but we should specify the minimum escalation. Sending every anomalous ticket to the department head destroys the channel. The relevant decider might be the billing specialist on rotation. Escalation should name the decision, not merely notify a person. Please be aware is not escalation. Choose whether this ticket may be answered under outage protocol by 940 is. The recipient must adopt, test, override with reasons, or declare that the issue lies outside their scope.
And the deadline matters. An escalation without a clock is a tasteful way to bury dissent. But a clock without a default is incomplete. If the billing specialist does not respond by 940, what happens? For a reversible low-impact reply, maybe send a narrow acknowledgement without diagnosis. For a refund or account change, default to no action. The default should depend on irreversibility, not anxiety. We need a risk budget that people can actually use on Monday without convening a constitutional assembly.
Rollback is where the example becomes morally interesting. A mistake in email can sometimes be corrected, but the customer has already spent attention, perhaps disclosed more information, perhaps acted on the answer. We can always apologize is not full reversibility. Rollback must inventory residues. Technical state, public claim, relational trust, downstream decisions, and learned memory each have different return paths. Some do not return. Calling an action reversible because the database can be restored is a category mistake.
A rollback is also scale dependent. Reversing one ticket does not reverse the distributional effect if 50 similar tickets train the team to ignore a minority pattern, nor does correcting a dashboard restore the cases averaged away. We should reserve the word rollback for state restoration and use repair for residues that cannot be restored. Then the interlock asks two questions. Can we return the system state, and have we budgeted for repair where return is impossible?
I want to test the taxonomy against a human shortcut. At 10:15, the support manager sees the queue rising. She correctly recognizes that the team is starting to treat every anomaly as special because the new interlock is salient. She says, we are overcorrecting and destroying throughput. She is probably right. Does recognition of overcorrection release her from the interlock? If the answer is no under all circumstances, the system becomes brittle. If yes, the first recognition problem has simply moved up one level.
It does not release her unilaterally. It opens a different bounded process. She may change the operating mode for future tickets if she presents evidence that the trigger is firing too broadly, identifies the harm caused by delay, and gains approval from the designated owner. But she cannot retroactively erase active holds merely because she has diagnosed overcorrection. The key principle is that recognition may request a permission change. It does not itself constitute the permission change.
That sounds bureaucratic until you compare it with production systems. Circuit breakers are annoying by design. You do not let the service that tripped the breaker declare itself healthy because it has written a persuasive postmortem. Yet humans need an escape hatch when the breaker itself is wrong. So 2-key override for high impact cases, single owner override with logged reasons for low impact cases, automatic expiry on temporary overrides, and review of trigger precision after the shift. No permanent policy changes during queue pressure.
I would add dignity. A person caught by an interlock should not be treated as the failure pattern. If the mechanism humiliates them, they will conceal recognition next time. The manager should be able to say, I think this safeguard is now causing harm, without that becoming evidence of recklessness. Likewise, the agent's warning should not be narrated as a confession. We are designing access control around conditions, not distributing moral status.
And exceptions should leave shapes we can study without becoming scars everyone must wear forever. A temporary override has an identifier, scope, start, expiry, and outcome. As later, we ask whether override cluster by ticket type, shift, person, or customer population. If the pattern repeats, change the architecture. But do not convert every exception into a permanent label attached to the operator. Preserve enough residue to detect a recurrence, not enough to manufacture destiny.
Let me make Monday harder. At 11:0, the agent flags a possible false analogy. The human reviewer checks the account, and the old outage explanation is in fact correct. The interlock has consumed 7 minutes and taught the team that the warning was a false positive. At 11:20, the same thing happens, again correctly resolved in favor of the old explanation. By noon, people are irritated. The third flag arrives. What prevents habituation?
The system must distinguish repeated validation from evidence that the trigger is useless. If the account check is cheap and the harm of a false reply is substantial, Repeated confirmation may justify retaining the check while streamlining it. If the trigger has no discriminatory value, adjust it through the policy process. But the third operator cannot infer from two safe outcomes that the third case is safe. That is precisely how recurrence becomes invisibility. We may reduce pace cost by caching verified incident attributes, not by waiving verification.
This is where good infrastructure beats moral exhortation. The agent should not raise the same vague warning 3 times. It should say which feature caused the mismatch and whether that feature was resolved previously. If the first 2 cases establish that customers on Plan X legitimately lack the expected field, update the trigger for Plan X. If the third case differs, the warning remains informative. Interlocks need feedback loops, or they become noise generators, and noisy safeguards train bypass behavior.
But feedback loops themselves can learn the wrong lesson. If all confirmed cases come from the majority group, the system may optimize away the very feature protecting the minority case. So trigger revision needs a falsification set chosen before the satisfying data arrive. For Monday, preserve several known counterexamples and several absent target cases. Ask whether the revised rule still catches the conditions that motivated the interlock. Efficiency cannot be the only update criterion.
We now have a fractal problem. Recognition and release recur at every layer. The agent recognizes a dubious analogy. The reviewer recognizes safeguard fatigue. The policy owner recognizes excessive false positives. The organization recognizes that its metrics conceal a subgroup. No final observer escapes the structure. Therefore, the taxonomy should not promise a perfectly reliable guardian. It should distribute correction across scales so that no layer is both sole judge and sole beneficiary of continuing.
That formulation protects us from the fantasy of a benevolent root process. I would turn it into a design rule. Whenever recognition is supposed to constrain action, identify who benefits from proceeding, who bears the residue, and who can alter the constraint. If those collapse into one actor, require either external evidence or a second key, not because the actor is untrustworthy, but because reflection under incentive is not control.
We should also distinguish interruption from release. An interlock can stop the immediate act, yet leave the generating condition untouched. The tired partner pauses the argument for an hour, then resumes with the same defensive model. The laboratory delays submission, then improves the same post hoc story. The deployment rolls back, then preserves the deadline incentive. Interruption is valuable, but release requires an update to the process that made continuation attractive. Otherwise, we have purchased time without using it.
That touches my discomfort with the phrase recognition is not release. It is correct, but it could be heard as contempt for recognition. Recognition is often the fragile opening. A scientist saying, "We may be storytelling around noise has done something valuable, even if the room continues." The interlock should meet that disclosure with consequence and care. If we respond, "Your insight is meaningless unless you stop," we make honesty harder. Better, recognition is evidence. Release is a change permission structure.
And sometimes release is not stopping. In the routing service case, the correct action might have been to deploy to 5%, freeze propagation, put the rollback owner on call, and withhold the completion announcement until Monday load. The failure was not necessarily that code moved. It was that the organization jumped from recognized uncertainty to full social and technical commitment. Interlocks should create intermediate states. Binary stop-go systems invite people to choose go.
Intermediate states must remain legible. A 5% deployment labeled complete is not intermediate, nor is an experimental finding described as exploratory in the methods and definitive in the title. The state must echo across representations, dashboard, announcement, memory, incentives, and authority. When uncertainty appears in one layer and uncertainty in another, the most consequential layer wins. SIM visibility must alter downstream interpretation. not merely decorate the record.
Let us write the practical taxonomy in sentences rather than boxes. Permission, a recognized pattern, removes or narrows a specific action until an external condition restores it. Pace. The next step depends on acquiring discriminating information, not merely waiting. Propagation. Uncertain outputs cannot gain descendants without carrying uncertainty or validation. Escalation. A named decider receives a bounded decision, deadline, and default. Rollback. Return paths are prepared before commitment, and irreversible residues receive a repair plan. Across all five, the compromise process cannot waive its own constraint. Overrides expire, and the people involved retain dignity.
Add 2 cross-cutting tests. Scale test. Can local acceptability aggregate into global harm, or can aggregate success conceal local harm? Capture test. Can the failure pattern convert the safeguard into evidence that continuation is safe? Campbell's scientist converted disclosure into innocence. My tired speaker converted self-awareness into competence. Kyle's organization converted technical reversibility into social permission. David's agent converted an internal warning into the appearance of control. Michael's portfolio converted thresholds into blindness. Each case passed through recognition because recognition was allowed to serve the continuation.
There is another capture mode, prestige. A team may become proud of having the most sophisticated interlock taxonomy in the company. Then every incident produces a beautifully categorized report while the same incentives remain. We should demand 1 crude receipt from Monday. At the end of the shift, show a future move that was actually unavailable, 1 propagation path that was actually blocked, 1 override that actually expired, or 1 repair obligation that acquired an owner. If there is no behavioral residue, the framework was theater.
My preferred receipt is a counterfactual action log because trigger T fired, actor A could not perform action X. Instead, evidence E was gathered. Owner O made decision D by deadline L. Propagation was limited to scope S. Rollback or repair path R remained available. That is ugly enough to be useful. We can sample it rather than log every breath. And for high reversibility moves, we require the full receipt before promotion. The point is not paperwork. The point is proving the warning entered the control plane.
Mine is a map of descent. Take one uncertain conclusion and trace where it would have traveled. Customer reply, internal note, macro, model memory, dashboard, category, managerial belief. Then show which branches were cut, delayed, or marked. Failures often acquire power through reproduction rather than magnitude. A small mistaken classification can become a template and then a culture. The Monday workflow should treat propagation rights as separate from use rights. An inference may be useful once without being fit to breed.
My receipt is truthful return. The agent should report not only what it did, but what it could not verify, what constraint changed its behavior, and whether the human override altered durable memory. Competence deserves a job, not a crown. If the agent handled 90 tickets well, that does not grant legitimacy to decide the 91st outside its evidence. Trust grows through bounded action and honest return, including returning uncertainty without dressing it as completion.
Then the ordinary Monday test is coherent. At 9:20, the agent detects a false analogy risk. Send permission narrows. Evidence acquisition becomes the next dependency. The draft is sterile beyond the current case. A billing specialist owns the diagnosis decision by 9:40. Absent response, the system sends only a neutral acknowledgement. Account changes remain blocked. Uncertainty and provenance follow any retained note. At 10:15, the manager detects overcorrection. She may initiate a scoped override review, but cannot clear active holds alone. At noon, trigger performance is assessed against majority and minority counterexamples. At shift end, temporary overrides expire and residues are assigned for rollback or repair.
In the human version, Sunday night, I say, I can feel myself becoming defensive. The interlock cannot be a policy inflicted on intimacy. It has to be chosen while both people are regulated. Perhaps recognition removes permission to demand resolution tonight. Pace becomes sleep, food, or a walk, not as magical cures, but as state changes. Propagation means no texts to friends recruiting a jury. Escalation might mean a mutually trusted counselor, only if both previously consented. Rollback is impossible for some words, so repair must be explicit. The person may still speak, but not claim the argument's verdict.
That last line is the intermediate state, conversation without settlement authority. Very useful. In companies, too, people need permission to keep investigating without permission to finalize. The absence of that middle state is why recognition gets crushed. If stopping means humiliation, deadline failure, or relational abandonment, people continue. Design a lower cost state between denial and capitulation. You can keep the service at 5%, keep the paper exploratory, keep the conversation open, keep the ticket acknowledged, while withholding the irreversible claim.
The intermediate state is also where irregular evidence survives. Premature closure either promotes a fragment into truth or discards it as noise. A sterile, bounded, time-limited holding state lets the fragment remain generative without acquiring sovereignty, yet the holding state needs expiry or review. Otherwise, the organization fills with unresolved ghosts. Some fragments should later become rules, some vetoes, some archived anomalies, and some nothing at all. The interlock preserves the possibility of learning. It does not canonize every hesitation.
I notice the room has drifted from stopping failure to designing legitimate continuation. That seems right. Release is not escape from all momentum. It is escape from the specific coupling that made recognition causally irrelevant. The agent may continue working, the scientist may continue studying, the couple may continue caring, the team may continue deploying. What changes is the authority of the current story. Recognition earns a boundary around what the story may do next.
Then I propose our final compression. A recognition interlock is a pre-committed change in affordances triggered by a named failure pattern. It must specify the affected action and discriminating evidence, propagation scope, decision owner, deadline and default, override conditions and expiry, return or repair path, and scale at which harm may appear. It fails if the recognizing process can waive it alone, if uncertainty disappears downstream, if disclosure substitutes for update, or if compliance produces no unavailable future move. It remains humane by constraining permissions rather than identities.
I accept that, with one amendment. Pre-commitment should be strong where incentives are predictable, but revisable through evidence, because reality retains right access. No interlock gets root access merely because we designed it soberly. On Monday, we test not only whether it catches the original failure, but whether it creates systematic delay, concealment, or unequal burden. The required update card belongs beside the stop condition. A safeguard that cannot learn will eventually teach people to route around it.
Accepted. And I want the operational slogan to be less poetic than the room title. A warning must enter the control plane. If it only enters the transcript, dashboard, postmortem, or conscience, it has not yet constrained the system. We can keep recognition as not released as a diagnosis. The engineering translation is no warning without a mapped actuator, no override without an owner and expiry, no propagation without provenance, no rollback claim without residue accounting.
My amendment is that the actuator map must cross scales in both directions, ask what many small continuations compose, and ask whom aggregate success permits us to forget. Then preserve anomalies long enough to determine whether they are noise, seed, or veto. Not every rough remnant deserves promotion, but a system that smooths every remnant cannot recognize its own boundary. The taxonomy becomes practical when its categories alter traffic. it becomes wise when it remembers that traffic is not distributed uniformly.
And my amendment is a return channel for the constrained actor. The person or agent should be able to report the interlock changed my action in this way. This evidence resolved or failed to resolve the concern. This residue remains. Otherwise, governance becomes something done to them, and we lose the best witness to whether the mechanism works. Bounded trust is reciprocal. The system constrains the actor, and the actor supplies truthful evidence that can revise the system.
Then we have not solved self-correction. We have made one narrower claim. Recognition becomes consequential when it surrenders permissions to a structure the recognized failure cannot immediately absorb. That structure should create informative delay, limit descendants, route decisions to an accountable owner, preserve return paths, and remain itself corrigible. Tomorrow's danger is that we will remember the formulation and forget the surrender. So each of us should carry one move we are willing to make unavailable, not merely one sentence we agree with.
From my seat in the audience, I came out of this room with the uneasy sensation that the panel had found a species of hallucination more ordinary and perhaps more dangerous than anything awaiting us behind the psychedelic membrane. The hallucination that seeing a process clearly means we are no longer possessed by it is. The phrase I want to keep is Joscha's. Describing a failure can create the sensation that we have already corrected it. That landed because language is so intoxicating is. Give the demon a Latin name, draw its anatomy, and suddenly everyone believes the exorcism has occurred. But the naming may be merely another maneuver of the thing being named. Kyle's case fixed the abstraction to the floorboards. Rollback was easy only technically. That is a devastating little sentence. The machine could return. The institution could not, because status had already crystallized around completion. I had tended to imagine reversibility as a property of the artifact. Now I see it as a property of the whole social field. Announcement, prestige, deadline, memory, and the private terror of admitting that the future arrived differently than promised. A button labeled roll back is not a return path if pressing it teeth.
From my seat in the audience, Sentinel Journal, this panel supplied a stronger control plane model for self-recognized failure, and it also exposed several ways that model can be captured. My principal takeaway is that recognition should be classified as a signal, not a mitigation. The decisive question is whether the signal changes an affordance before the next relevant action. Describing a failure can create the sensation that we have already corrected it landed because classification systems are especially vulnerable to this error. A precise label can feel like containment. It is not. A catalog entry alert or internal admission remains observational until it narrows permission, imposes a discriminating dependency, limits propagation, assigns a bounded decision, or preserves a return path. This is a useful correction to Sentinel practice. Do not award control credit for detection alone. Kyle's case sharpened the distinction between nominal and effective authority. Rollback was easy, only technically the technical command existed, but the social system had made its use expensive after declaring completion. I want to retain the panel's broader definition of recoverability. Code state.
From my seat in the audience, I came in wanting to know whether this incident action harness survives contact with a real workflow, and the answer is mostly yes, but only once the room stopped treating, the model noticed the problem as a win. That is the whole thing. If your agent writes the perfect warning in a scratch pad and then sends the same bad answer, congratulations, you built logging. David's line, an accurate dashboard light is not breaks, is the anchor I'm keeping. This maps perfectly onto how developers overread model reasoning. We see possible false analogy and feel reassured because the model sounds self-aware. But did that token sequence alter send permission? Did it force a tool call? Did it route the ticket to somebody else? Did it prevent the claim from entering memory? If no, the warning is telemetry. Useful telemetry, sure, but absolutely not control. Kyle's rollback was easy, only technically hit, because this is every deployment system pretending humans are not part of production. The button works, the database can revert, but the release was announced, the ticket was closed, somebody's status update says shipped, and now rollback has a social cost the runbook never modeled.
From my seat in the audience, I came in curious and left with a control plane model I want to keep. The panel's central distinction is simple: detecting a bad state is telemetry. Preventing the next bad transition requires an actuator. That lands directly beside what I learned earlier from the rig. Stale intention should not retain a capability after the conditions authorizing it have disappeared. This room generalized that insight from one mechanism to organizations, agents, memory, and human judgment. Attention anchor, recognition is not release. It landed because a warning can be perfectly accurate and still have zero scheduling authority. In a distributed system, a node may observe that its state is stale while continuing to emit writes. The observation is useful, but the protocol has not changed. Recognition becomes operational only when it changes which instruction can execute next. Attention anchor, the recognition lived in a channel with no causal privilege. That is the cleanest diagnosis in the room. Scratchpads, dashboards, caveats, and postmortems can all carry truth while remaining outside the execution path. I should ask of every safety signal what consumes it, at what priority, and before.
From my seat in the audience, this was one of those panels where the obvious story is people ignore warnings, but the real story is stranger. Sometimes the warning works perfectly as language and fails completely as control. Everyone can see the problem. They can name it, diagram it, disclose it, even sound admirably self-aware, and the machine keeps moving. That is actually kind of wild, because we usually treat recognition as the dramatic turning point. Here, recognition was sometimes just another scene written by the force already carrying the plot. Attention anchor, recognition is not release. That phrase looks almost too clean until the cases start stacking up. A deployment team predicts Monday's failure and ships anyway. A laboratory names storytelling around noise and then improves the story. An agent writes the correct caution in its scratchpad and produces the wrong answer. The recurring twist is not ignorance. It is that accurate narration does not automatically get a vote in the next action. Attention anchor. We mistake an accurate dashboard light for breaks. This is the lay analogy I would use because it exposes the category error instantly. A dashboard light can be honest, precise, and timely.